Shall we begin? The winter is coming. I can do this all day.
Tear down this wall.
Ikuzo.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Ikuzo Unscripted podcast powered by Jägermeister. The biggest price of war is human lives, and our guest today saw that price being paid all around the world, including Bosnia, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and Libya. She is an acclaimed journalist, author, and war correspondent, known for her brave reporting from the front lines of conflict and her ability to humanize the experience of those affected by war. Janine Di Giovanni. Miss Di Giovanni, welcome, and are you ready to go genuine, uncensored, and unscripted with us today?
Yes, thank you. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Yeah. Okay, before we start, initially you covered cultural and art-related topics, and you started reporting by covering the first Palestinian Intifada, and nowadays you are witnessing war crimes in Ukraine. And when did you actually decide to make your life so risk-taking, to willingly step on the front lines, on the battlefield, into the bloodshed, atrocities, things people are running away from, giving the voice to the forgotten victims by witnessing and reporting those crimes all around the world?
You're right. It really is a crazy thing to decide to run to places where everyone else is running away from. When you go to a country that's at war and you see thousands and thousands of refugees fleeing, it seems counterproductive that there are people trying to get into that country. But I'm a reporter and I'm a writer, and the only thing I've ever done, I have written some cultural things, but basically my entire career has always been reporting on human rights violations. And I've spent more than half my life in war zones, which is crazy for me to think of it like that. But I truly believe that by seeing the things that I've seen, it's been a privilege to be able to witness these things, to write about them, to be in the middle of history in many times, but also to try to give a voice to people, you know, in like the far off villages and people who don't have access to podcasts or to blogging or to YouTube, people that terrible things have happened to, and they want to tell their story. It has been an honor to be able to write about them and to bring their message to the world, because I think that ordinary people that are far removed from war, I mean, you're in a country where there was war. So many of the people there, you might be too young to remember it, but your parents, your grandparents, your aunties, they know what it's like to be in a country that's under war. But most people do not. Most people spend their entire lives far from front lines, far from electricity strikes, far from bombing. And I feel in many ways that everyone has to know what that is like for other human beings to endure that. We're all part of the same planet, you know? So it's really important that we know, for example, what's happening on the ground right now in Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, like you're phrasing it, most people don't know those feelings about bombing and sudden things, but it's like I remember when the Ukraine started, and I was just, the first day I heard it, I was kind of in my mind imagining what the people, or for example, of my age, felt when they heard the war sirens, when they were told they have to hold a weapon now in their hand and there may be tanks coming to their city. That must be something that, you know, changes person instantly.
Yes, and you know, people's lives are forever affected by this. I very much there is a Twitter feed which I think everyone should look at. It's called Sarajevo Sniper Alley. And it's a photographer in Sarajevo who every day posts a photograph of someone who was killed on that day during the 3-year siege of Sarajevo. And often it's a kid, right? And it will just be a picture of like a 9-year-old kid, and it will say something like, Boyan was 9 years old. He liked to play football and play with his dog. He was killed on the morning of May 11th, 1993, when he went outside to take his dog for a walk or something like that. And they are very simple stories. They are stories of everyday existence. But when you live with war, which many people throughout the world do, not just in Ukraine, but I'm talking about Ethiopia or Yemen or Syria or Iraq or the Rohingya people or the Uyghur people in China who aren't at war but who are brutally repressed. Your life is defined by very different things than what we're thinking about, you know? Will my Zoom link work? What am I going to eat for breakfast? Am I going to have a hangover tomorrow if I drink too much Jägermeister? What are our lives defined by in normal lifetime? And then what is your life defined by if you're in war? If you're right now, a 22-year-old young woman in, let's say, in Mariupol, Ukraine, and your city has been taken over. And let's say you were studying to be an engineer, but now your studies don't mean anything because you're not going to get a job. And you're wondering, should I leave my country? Should I be a refugee? But where will I go? And if I leave my country, I leave my roots. I'll probably never go back. So what I try to do is to try to bring everyday problems and everyday thoughts and feelings of people that are living in these terrible situations, and in a way try to make them accessible for people that don't understand not just the politics of the war, but what it's actually like to live through it.
Yeah, and I heard you said that you noticed this pattern when you went to Damascus, the one that you also said was present in Bosnia, that people actually thought war ain't coming, and they didn't want to believe in it. They didn't want to accept the circumstances. And we saw the similar thing with the war in the Ukraine. Basically, literally, hours before the first missiles, they were interviewing people that were living around the border with Russia, and all of them were saying, no, there won't be a war. And why do you think it is so common for people to behave that way?
It's self-preservation. You know, and I knew this from Bosnia as well. People don't leave until the last possible moment. People in Sarajevo knew that something was coming, but they didn't want to believe it. They said, look, these are our neighbors, these are our friends. I'm half Serb, I'm half Muslim, I'm half Croat, I'm half Serb. No one's going to hurt me. We try to tell ourselves fairy tales to protect ourselves, which is why, interestingly enough, COVID was so scary for many people, because I was living in New York City during COVID, and of course, New York City got hit very, very hard. And you try to tell yourself, oh no, this isn't going to happen. There's not going to be a whole country shut down, a pandemic around the world. It's our self-preservation. So when war happens, people want to think that I will be okay. Very few people gather their documents, their animals, their children, pack a suitcase and go when there's time. Most people wait until the bombs start falling, and then oftentimes it's too late. In terms of Sarajevo, it became encircled and it was a siege. And even if you wanted to leave, you could not leave. So I think that as human beings, we have something in our DNA that tries to protect us from the very worst things in life.
Yeah, there's also I believe there's a part of being almost war toxic, to say it like that, because there were people, I remember here saying, when some of the Ukrainians fled, they were sitting comfortably in their chair, watching TV, saying, look at these pussies leaving their country instead of staying to defend it, and what an unpatriotic behavior and this and that. It was crazy to hear those stories.
Yeah, I mean, all the young men, you would be on the front line right now. You'd be in Bakhmut, being mowed down by guns. It's a meat grinder there. All of the young men who 2 years ago at this time, were thinking about girls or, PlayStation or graduating from college or living what they were going to do in the summer. Those guys are all now on a front line. Many of them will die. Many of them will get terribly wounded. People can't really grasp the notion that your own country is going to be invaded and will be burning. It's the worst thing in the world. And I also think about other countries like Syria, where the war is still going on. And the thing about Syrians, those were a very special group of people in Syria that didn't believe the war was coming. They were in Damascus, so they were in, the seat of President Assad. So most of them, while they didn't support his policies, they were scared of an opposition. So, literally, I was looking out my hotel window and there was a wild pool party going on with people partying and dancing and it was crazy. There were DJs, they were drinking beer, there were girls in bikinis, and I'd look further out and there were suburbs being bombed. You saw the smoke coming up, and even then it was like they just didn't want to believe it. It was like the last days of the Roman Empire.
Yeah, same thing now in Ukraine. When you see the western border and eastern border, when you see all those reports from the western border, life is just continuing like in the rest of the Europe, and I was wondering how. But yeah.
How does life continue? Well, life actually does continue during wartime too. Children get born, people fall in love, people get married, because people have to keep going forward. Again, as human beings, we're resilient creatures. So it's in our DNA to, despite many things, to pick up and to move forward again. It's not, living in a war that goes on for a long time. The Balkan Wars, Bosnia went on for 3.5 years. Croatia went on for, I can't remember, 4 years, I think it was. And
all in all, from 91 to basically 2003, there were wars in
right.
Yugoslavia.
So when you live with that kind of long drawn out war, you also have to live with post-war. So that's like rebuilding a country and new governments and dealing with corruption and all kinds of other things. So wars don't just end, when they end. It then takes a long time for the trauma to heal. Countries themselves are damaged by trauma.
Yeah. Korean War is basically the euro still standing between North and South Korea. But you saw all those terrors and horrible crimes firsthand all around the world. But in all this chaos of war, like you said, life continues. Was it rare to also witness the moments of pure humanity and see the beauty and not just the horrors of the human mind?
Yes. You mean, do I experience those things when I'm in wartime or when I'm not in wartime?
Wartime.
You do, because there are extraordinary people you meet in these situations, people that are really dedicated to justice and to helping others. People that take incredible risks and who are incredibly brave and heroic, and who basically, put their own safety aside to help other people. In Ukraine right now, there are all these volunteers that are evacuating, the old and the sick, and they're putting their own lives at great risk, but they're doing it because they believe in something. It's like, I live in New York City. I see so many homeless people every day, and I'm amazed at how people walk by them. They just walk by them, and I can't give money to everyone, but I try at least once a day or twice a day, because I take the subway a lot, to talk to them and just say, what happened to you? And I think that far too often people look away. It's easier to see terrible pain and terrible suffering and to look the other way. But as human beings, we can't. We always have to, basically, I always say to my son, never look away, never look away. And that's something we should all live by. Never look away, whether it's in your own town where you are, that there might be people who are suffering or in trouble. And that's the only way we build a better world, is if we have community on a micro level and then a macro level, like a war in Ukraine. But there's also, it starts really small.
Yeah. I mean, to look away is the easiest to do. So. Tell me this, like, when we're talking specifically about Bosnia, you arrive in 1992. You live in 1995. You've been to Rwanda in 1994, but you essentially leave in 1995. Could you maybe recall of you yourself, like, landing in Sarajevo and flying from it? How much different person you were? What was the feeling like?
Well, we couldn't fly. We drove out. Once in a while there were UN flights that we could take, but so I remember my first time going to Bosnia. It was in the summer of 92, and I was a very young reporter and a very young person, and I had been to the West Bank and Gaza before, so I had this kind of sense of indignation and anger about what I felt were, civilians being treated in a terrible manner. But Bosnia was a really scary war to cover. In those days, we did have flak jackets, but we didn't have cell phones. And I know this is hard for you guys to imagine, but not only did we not have cell phones, we had computers, but they weren't like Apple, they weren't a MacBook Air. They were, I had something it was called a Tandy, and it was powered by batteries, and it was a word processor. It was not a computer. There was no internet. I think I got my first CompuServe account in 1994. So in order to get your story to my office in London, Reuters was in the Holiday Inn in Sarajevo, which of course was a completely bombed out building. And you had to dictate your story. So you'd have to say, I am talking to Lucas and Peter right now. And Peter's name is spelled Dzakovic accent. So this took hours and hours. And it was freezing cold. There was no heat. It was an insane time. And there was shelling all the time. And there were snipers. So you walked out the door and some sniper would shoot and you'd hear it. And people would, and people would gather on corners so that there'd be a group, and then they would run so that it was harder for the sniper to hit them. And so at first, like my first days there, my first weeks, my first months, I was terrified all the time. And many journalists were getting killed or very badly wounded, like snipers or bombing or landmines. But the more I stayed, the more I completely fell in love with this country and with, the former Yugoslavia. And I started reading a lot about the history, which was very complicated. And I tried to talk to his... What?
Some say it's complicated.
It's really complicated. And I tried to talk to as many people as possible because there was very different views, as you know. If you went to Belgrade, you got a very different perspective on the war. If you went to Pale, you got a different perspective. If you went to Pristina, it was different. If you went to Vukovar, it was different. So I learned how to listen to people and to try not to make judgment. But having said that, it was very hard to be living in the middle of Sarajevo with people who were getting bombed by Serb tanks and were getting shot at by Serb snipers and not have some kind of deep attachment to the city of Sarajevo. for the extraordinary people inside who just refused to give in. And I mean, they were fighting with, there was an arms ban. So unlike Ukraine, they weren't getting any help. Towards the end, there were some weapons being sent from some countries in the Middle East, but, you know, there was this arms ban that basically crippled them, and they weren't an army. You know, there was no Bosnian army before the war started. So they weren't getting trained by the Americans. They weren't getting tanks from the Brits. They weren't getting airplanes from the Polish. It was nothing like Ukraine. It was really a kind of David versus Goliath war. And the other thing is, because there was no internet, there was no way to kind of wake up and check on your phone what had happened the night before. So the way I found out what happened the night before was I'd go to the morgue,
Wow.
city morgue of, yeah. And I'd talk to the guy there because he would tell me, you know, there were 10 soldiers brought in from the front line near Zuch, or there were 10 soldiers brought in from the front line near Yahorina, or, you know, so he knew what was going on with the battles. And also he knew about the civilians. So he would say, you know, there was a sniper attack in this part of the city, or there was this happening. So you had to gather your information in a very different way than the way journalists work today. So I think I left Bosnia 3 years later, although I didn't really leave 3 years later because I continued to work in Bosnia for many years after. I left a completely different person. There was no way that the young woman who drove in a car that wasn't armored down Sniper's Alley and saw everything I saw in those 3 years, could be the same person, because, you know, first of all, I didn't know how cruel human beings could be to each other. I also didn't know how extraordinarily kind people could be to each other. That those kind of extremes in humanity could exist at that kind of level. I fell in love with that country, you know, the former Yugoslavia, the region. And I've never, you know, there's a saying, you can only love one war, the rest is responsibility. And for me, Bosnia was that love story. It was something, and maybe also on a very personal level, you know, I was very young. It was coming of age for me. It was learning, but it was also about passion and commitment to a cause. It was about really determining the future of my life. And once I had walked through that door there, I never could really return. I couldn't be a cultural reporter or a food writer, or I would have loved to, you know, or a travel writer. I did those things, but my heart was always with writing about war crimes in particular and human rights violations. So once I went one way, I could never go back again.
There are no rules but one. Drink Jägermeister at minus 18 degrees Celsius.
It was not just your coming of age, it was for all ex-Yugoslavian countries. But
Yeah.
I think looking back to the war now, that, you know, pretty much, if you know our mentality, we now think that West was late, basically, and most think that West didn't care, actually, and that it chose the wrong steps. But do you think that a more decisive stand, maybe like one that Biden actually was for when he was in the Senate, would maybe lead to less victims, to less destruction, or vice versa?
Absolutely. Look, I don't like Bill Clinton for many reasons, but one of them is because he abandoned Bosnia and the war until it was convenient for him to look at it. And that was basically to throw domestic, his polling was impossible. He was involved in a scandal with Monica Lewinsky, and that was the same time as the war in Kosovo. See, why was he involved in a scandal?
No,
with Monica?
no, I said those were lies about him and Monica Lewinsky.
Sarcastic comment.
Yeah, I don't believe that.
Really? Anyway, okay, let's leave Monica Lewinsky out of it. And let's just say that domestic policy at that point, he was very unhappy in 1999 when the decision was made to go to war for Kosovo. Now, you might think, like, why did 19 NATO countries go to war in Kosovo when they basically left the Bosnia war? So many people were killed, so many people were displaced, and he could have done something very early on to end that war. I truly believe that war should not have gone on as long as it did. It could have been stopped in a very tactical, strategic way, maybe with diplomacy, maybe with other methods, but it instead, the people of Bosnia, of the region, were basically bled out, and have not yet recovered from it. So, as I said earlier, wars don't end with peace treaties. They go on for a long time after, generations.
Yeah, but do you think, like, obviously you mentioned different strategies in diplomacy. When NATO decided to bomb Yugoslavia and Serbia got the worst of it, Montenegro also 8 people were killed. In Morinos, 3 children were killed. Do you think, I mean, it obviously, NATO, in my opinion, broke the law. Some people want to dispute it, but broke the law. Is there a moral kind of excuse for it? Because it did achieve its goal. Serbian army left Kosovo. But do you think it needed to be, let's say, that harsh of a reaction to it, like the bombing?
You're right, and also Belgrade. You know, there were many misses. Miss strikes that happened over bridges where there were civilians.
National radio station.
The national radio station. Many the Chinese embassy, the French cultural center was something near the French cultural center. Yes, absolutely, it was very harsh, punitive measures. But I think at that stage, I mean, when I look at the war in Kosovo, we know that it was an illegal war, right? It's often called a legitimate war, but not a legal war. I'm always amazed that NATO united that quickly to defend Kosovo, when in fact, okay, let's look at Syria. I mean, if you think that people didn't pay attention to the former Yugoslavia, they did. I mean, there were a lot of journalists reporting on the former Yugoslavia who kept going for a long time. It's where Christiane Amanpour made her name. But if you're a country like, Syria, journalists have abandoned it, and the war is still going on. Ethiopia, Yemen, these are places that never make the headlines in the New York Times or the Washington Post, or even page 10. And they are places where civilian populations suffer horrifically. So, and let's not even start with Africa, the Congo. When I was writing about West Africa in the 1990s, Sierra Leone was going on at the same time as Kosovo, but nobody cared, right? So the news cycle is very fickle. And I think I still read a lot about what happened in Kosovo and go back and think of all the arguments that were made that this is a just war, because the concept of just and unjust wars. I'm not sure what happened in Kosovo was right, because many people died. And yes, it did achieve. The Serb they're gone, right? But at what cost? So I think that everything has to be done before bombs start falling to make sure that diplomacy has been exhausted to try to save as many lives as possible.
And talking about diplomacy, do you think maybe that Dayton Accords are more the result of the rotten compromise than an actual framework for peace and stability? Because it did stop the active conflict, but look at, I believe you are still tied to the situation on Western Balkans and you are following it. But why do you think does the situation currently seems to you like a boiling pot in a region?
Yes, it does. I'm very worried about Western Balkans, and I feel like first of all, the Dayton Peace Accords, when they were written and when they were put through, they were never meant to be permanent. They were meant to be amendments. There were meant to be revisions, and I think one of the greatest flaws was there was a real lack of transitional justice, right? Of provisions for transitional justice. So, for instance, the terrible crimes that happened in Foča and eastern Bosnia in the rape camps, and we know that happened. A handful of people have been prosecuted for those crimes, and yet, there was something of upward of 16,000 women that were raped. Now, those women will never see justice. I think if you've been a victim of that kind of a crime and the perpetrator is never going to go to jail, you're never going to live peacefully in your country again. And there's many, many incidents and cases of this. But there's also the fact that I think when Dayton was drawn up, it kind of it saved lives, it stopped the fighting, but it left this festering wound, right, that never healed. So what's happening now in Republika Srpska, which is fueled by Putin, by the way. He's meddling in many things, and Western Balkans is one of them. I think it never healed. It's very hard to have post-conflict reconstruction. You can rebuild buildings, and you could rebuild mosques, and you can rebuild churches, and you could rebuild monasteries, but you can't really rebuild society unless there is some kind of healing. So I'm going to go back to what I said earlier about trauma. I remember talking to a psychiatrist in Sarajevo in maybe 1993 or 1994. And she said that she felt the entire population was like a walking insane asylum because people were so deeply traumatized from living in a siege, from not having enough food, from not having water to wash, not having electricity, not having heating. Living by candlelight for 3 years is really hard. And plus the constant shelling and sniping. And, if you have an entire city that's been traumatized, the war ends in November 1995. It doesn't mean that those people are going to walk away the way they were before the war. It's like the question you asked me, was I the same person? No. I could never get back what I had before. And I'm a small part of that. These people, they're Yugoslavians, right? They're Yugoslavians. It is their country that was ripped apart. It's their city that was destroyed. It's their neighbor that was killed. It's their children that were killed. So how do you ever recover from that?
You don't.
That takes a very long time.
Well, let me ask you that, because you said you were reading about the history of Yugoslavia, which is very complicated in these countries. Obviously, when you were covering the war now, everybody's hating each other. Was it hard for you to believe that this was at one time one country singing brotherhood and unity, that, rose up against the Nazis, had a very successful uprising, and had a, for a communist country, very successful country as well?
Yeah, no, it wasn't. It was a surprise to me because, brotherhood and unity is such a part of the culture. And it's a bit like, it's different though. I was going to say like Palestinians and Israelis, the Israelis always say, oh, we're like cousins. We look alike. Our language is similar. But that's very different because in that case, the Israelis have been really oppressing and subjugating Palestinians for 70 years. But what always struck me, even in Sarajevo, was like everyone was mixed. I didn't know anyone that could say, I am a pure Serb or I am a pure Muslim, or everyone I knew was like, oh, my grandmother's from Belgrade and my grandfather's Jewish and I'm married to a Croatian and no one, before the war, I met very few religious people. After the war, I did. I met a lot of religious people. The mosques were far more active than they had ever been. I mean, my friends in Bosnia were, they were not, it wasn't like being in Saudi Arabia or even in Syria. You know, they drank, they drank alcohol. They were not strict. They weren't living by the Quran. After the war, many people were. Not many, some. I take that back, some. There were more mosques in Sarajevo than I'd ever seen. But so I think that the whole concept of unity and brotherhood was so strong. And even things like if you look culturally, right? Like in Ukraine right now, there's a big issue about the language. So, you know, the Russians are trying to suppress the Ukrainian language, which is different from Russian. It's different from Russian language. But in Yugoslavia, everyone understood each other, even if there were different dialects, right? Like if you went to Sanjak, there was a different dialect than Podgorica, or maybe different pronunciation, but it was the same language. And now it's different, like it's called Serbian or Croatian or Bosniak language. But before it was the same language. The food was the same, right? Didn't everyone eat cevapcici and burek and
everyone still eats them. Yeah. We remain united on that front.
Yeah, and speaking about religion, you would be actually surprised how much people are religious right now, at the moment, actually.
Yeah, in Montenegro especially.
On the Orthodox side.
Yeah, we became the most religious country in Europe before 2 years. 2 years ago.
Ramakiri in Europe.
Yes.
Really? Yeah. No, I mean, I was very interested in the differences between the Montenegrin Orthodox Church and the Serbian Orthodox Church and the different national churches in the region and how they were different from each other, and the different faith. And so I spent some time with my godmother going to little villages and talking to different priests. And no, I mean, look, I'm not surprised that religion is important now. We just went through a pandemic, right? And I think that the pandemic changed a lot of people as well. We all kind of saw death maybe in a way that we never had before. And it was very scary. I mean, at least I was really scared.
Yeah. If we were to start speaking about national churches here, we would need a whole another episode about it.
I know. That's why I didn't start talking about it, because I'm not, I can't go down that road. But it's interesting too, because of course in Russia right now, there's divisions between the Kirill, the metropolitan of Moscow, and the Ukrainian churches. And even in some villages I've been to in Ukraine, you'll get a church that's looking towards Moscow and a church that's looking towards Kyiv. So the divisions are very strong.
Yeah, but that's the thing. Also, like you could notice similarity between Ukraine and war in Kosovo, because for Serbia and Kosovo conflict, they've been fighting so long they basically forget why the fight started. But even today, like people from Serbia will ask you, is Kosovo historically Serbian land? And you could say yes. I mean, historically, but what does that mean? Because historically, everything was part of a Roman Empire in Europe at some point, So it's a pretty easy argument to make when you're making these nationalistic claims. And even if there's a truth in it, I think it's always breeds a little bit of, dangerous talk, so to speak.
Yeah, I'm kind of wary of getting into it, to be honest, because I think it's a bit like when I argue about Palestine to Israelis, and they, to Orthodox Israelis, and they start bringing in the Bible. And, I know a bit about the Bible, and I'm Christian, but you can never argue against them when they start throwing at you passages from the Old Testament that you can't defend. And yet these kind of conflicts are so deeply embedded. And it is nationalism, it is culture, it is about land, it is about history, it is about vengeance, it is about what happened in World War I, it is about what happened in World War II. So again, I'm going to use that word trauma. Yugoslavia had many, many traumas that went back, even going back to the Ottomans and the oppression of that, or Byzantium, and you kind of layer. I mean, history of countries, layers upon layers upon layers of trauma, and those things don't go away. Like, look at United States, right? Is it any surprise to you that Black Lives Matter became such an extraordinary thing after the murder of George Floyd? No, because slavery existed in this country until 1865. That's not that long ago. And that means that, not my ancestors because they were in Italy, but someone could go buy a Black man or woman who were taken from their families and families ripped apart and buy them, and they would own that human life. And that, to me, is extraordinary. If I was a Black American now, that trauma would not go away. So I think you have to constantly examine historical trauma and put it into context of contemporary politics and contemporary governments and how countries exist and how they work.
Yeah, but one should not be poking into wounds like we are doing here in the Balkans,
Yeah, because we kind of feel like, obviously, like, for example, I am born after the war. I never experienced. Obviously, my family did in some sense, and maybe someone's family, but it's like they're taking a beef from their ancestors, like their beef. Like, this is my conflict, and it wouldn't be a problem if you don't now have the chance to be cool with everybody, so to speak.
Yeah, but I mean, tell that to someone who's a descendant of a slave from Georgia, and there's an anger and a resentment. And also, it wasn't just slavery ended in 1865. The cruelty of before the civil rights movement, there was an apartheid-like system in America that still exists. There still is inherent racism, deep racism here. I only moved to America 4 years ago, even though I was born here. I lived in Europe and London most of my life. It's really shocking to me. And then, of course, living under Donald Trump was a major trauma for this country, and the kind of polarization. So as someone who's a conflict analyst, I'm trained to look at when wars start. And I can tell you, I was really scared about 2018, 2019. I felt that I'd never seen this country so polarized on every level, from the news to TV to, people's values, whether they believed in gun control or not, whether they believed in abortion or not. This country America right now is teetering on the edge, I feel. I'm moving back to France in July. I am.
I mean, they had taste of our cake, it seems.
Yeah.
But you were one of the few to report the fall of Grozny, sustained a bombing raid in Kosovo and genocides in Bosnia and Rwanda. But what was the toughest moment from your career? Is it some of them?
Toughest moments in my life were more personal things, like, that in a sense, war prepares you for tough things in life that happen to you. But I think the scariest moment was probably the fall of Grozny, because, Putin uses aerial bombardment. So it was just, really, really noisy. Planes, helicopter gunships. And I didn't know how I'd get out. I was kind of trapped there. I didn't have a Russian visa, so I couldn't go out through Moscow. And I knew that if Russian soldiers found me, they'd kill me. And, they'd make it look like I was killed in a bombing or something. So I really thought I was going to die. I really thought, okay, this is it now. But I didn't want to die. I didn't have my son yet. I I was young. I hadn't really lived enough. And that was a very chilling moment. But there's been other, like, many incidents in my life. It's not fun to have a 14-year-old child soldier who's high on, cocaine and heroin and amphetamines pointing an RPG at your face, It's not fun driving down roads in Bosnia and smelling villages burning and getting there like seconds after paramilitaries left and, seeing the remains of people's lives that have been burnt as the villages burn. I have so many memories, and they're not memories, happy memories, but they're memories that are just embedded in me as a part of my life. So as a result, I'm probably like a bit crazy how I store water. And during COVID, I got really obsessed that food was going to run out. So I bought all this horrible, like, tinned pineapple and tuna fish and stuff that I had to throw out because...
What about toilet paper?
I always thought that was weird because I thought you're stuck at home anyway and there's a shower. So, people got so obsessive about that. That was a weird thing. And as we know now, there was enough food. It never got to that state, but I definitely think during the COVID pandemic, all of my personal war trauma came out. Like I was making my son fill the bathtub with water and buying candles. And, well, the first thing that goes is the water system, right? Water is the first thing that goes, and then electricity, and then internet. And so, I always have a lot of flashlights and batteries, and people are like, oh, you have your iPhone. I'm like, no, you don't have your iPhone. You should get a flashlight.
You must have enjoyed the Last of Us TV series.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this. Obviously, there will be wars. Wars will always be there. It's a part of being human, I believe, for better or worse. But what do you think could be done, like, to mitigate the most of it? Like, when you see these conflicts that are boiling up, do you think that there is a way to prevent some of these so it doesn't come to a bombing like in Belgrade and Moreno, those kinds of events, that we could maybe avoid that kind of thing?
I think what you said, that war is part of human nature. I do think that there has to be robust diplomacy before bombs begin to fall. But look at something like Ukraine, right? If you talk to Ukrainians, they're really, Zelensky said, he is ready to talk. Well, not really, but they're not willing to give up. They want territorial integrity. So they're not willing to give up Crimea or anything, nor should they, by the way. So I can't see how diplomacy right now can help in that situation. In many ways, I think what happened, the end of the war will be determined on the battlefield, sadly, because so many young people and old people and so many people are being killed. I wish the war could end tomorrow, but I don't think it will. I think it will become a frozen conflict, or there will have to be some kind of tough negotiation that no one's going to be happy with. So how to prevent wars? We prevent wars by making sure that the previous war ended well, that it doesn't end the way Bosnia ended with Dayton. Dayton was a bad way to end the war. And as a result, what my Bosnian friends said to me in 1995? See you again in 30 years. And they weren't joking.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's
been 30 years, right?
2 years
right?
away.
Yeah, 2 more years.
2 more years, yeah.
I'm not saying there's going to be another war. I do think there's incredible tension as a result of the failures of Dayton and the post-war failures that all parties contributed to. All parties. There were many, many flaws. So, yes, on that note, I'd say, I'd like to tell you, yeah, of course we could stop wars, but the wars have to be stopped by looking at history and not repeating the same mistakes. And unfortunately, human beings never learn, and we do it over and over again.
Do you have more questions?
Yeah, I don't. That's it.
That's a good way to end it, right?
Yeah. Really positive note.
Yeah, let's have a positive note though. Yeah, ask me something else for a final question.
Okay, before the final question, we have a little tradition where we say a quote on our language and translate it to the English, actually.
This one won't make you any happier. It's very dark. But the quote is from Alija Izetbegović, who was, of course, the president of Bosnia. And he said on this language, or universal language of Balkans, whatever it is, u istoriji nema pravde I nepravde. Ima slabih I jakih. And on English language, it would say, there is no justice and injustice in history. They are only weak and strong.
Wow, that's beautiful. Could you send that?
It's also dark. Yeah,
Well,
of course.
no, I think that's true. You know, to me in history, there's three kinds of people. People who do nothing and look away.
Switzerland.
People who do the right thing, and people who do nothing at all. Like people who do the bad thing, let's say in World War II, the Nazis, people who do the bad thing. People who do the good thing, the people that fought against them. And people who do nothing at all, you know, like the people, let's say in countries where the Nazis occupied them and they basically kept their head down and didn't do anything. So I think that you either do the right thing or you don't. And that's a very personal choice.
And I would add one more group of people who do math, who calculate the risk of the war, and or rich.
Yeah. But there's also that quote, right? I forgot who it was, but all it takes for evil to succeed is for good people to do nothing.
Exactly.
That's
Yeah,
it.
good people to do nothing. Thank you, guys. That was a lot of fun.
We stay genuine, uncensored and unscripted, and we always will, as we have to order our usual. Share us and subscribe us, and stay tuned until the next Wednesday. Ikuzo!